All right, so let's talk about exchange rates here. Last piece, we're kind of returning back to the later chapters in the textbook. So, exchange rates. Now, some of you may not have had much experience with international currencies. Some of you may have had a fair bit of experience. I suspect that most of you, at least at some point in your life, are going to end up either traveling to a country that uses different currency or doing some transactions in a currency or experiencing and observing the fluctuation in exchange rates. And so the question will be, what explains these? But before we get there, maybe we can just look at this table. So one of the keys here is on the left we have how many of the unit of currency that across the top gets you. So if you look in the first off diagonal, or the first diagonal there, we have how many US dollars you get for $1 US, and obviously that's one. So those dashes are going to be where it's one for one. $1 US at the time when I pulled these figures, which is quite a while ago, but again, the point is the same. You can pull this information. You can pull up a table like this very quickly on the internet. So $1 US at the time I pulled this up got you 0.93 euros. $1 US got you 121-ish yen, 0.67 pounds, 0.99 Swiss francs, 1.27 Canadian dollars, and so on. It also got you 1,200 Iraqi dinar. Yeah, I think I said the other day that the exchange rate was like 2,500 to 1. It's been too long since I've been back to Iraq, so we're looking at around 1,200 dinar per dollar. On the other hand, 1 euro gets you 1.065 euros. Now the difference, if you look at how much a dollar will get you in euros versus how much a euro will get you in dollars, that may not look like a terribly large difference, which is why I put in Iraqi dinar. So $1 US at the time of these figures was 1,200 dinar per dollar. So if you walk up with $1, you get 1,200 dinar. However, if you go over and figure out how many dollars 1 dinar will get you, 1 dinar gets you $0.0008. And so one of the first things to note to stave off confusion when dealing in exchange rates is that the direction is going to matter a lot. Are we talking about dollars per dinar? Or are we talking about dinar per dollars? Are we talking euros per dollar? Or are we talking dollars per euro? So that's the first area where people tend to get balled up, is that these exchange rates, they're the reciprocal of each other, but that it makes a really big difference which one you're using. Right? So the price of a dollar in dinar is not the same thing as the price of a dinar in dollars. Now, I'm going to make the claim here that what we should use if we're looking at the dinar market is dollars per dinar. In which case we have a supply of dinar, we have a demand for dinar, and we have the exchange rate here. Now I'm further going to argue that we should be dealing with probably in effect a vertical supply. But before we get to that point, let me just ask you why I make the claim that if you're looking at the dinar market, you should look at dollars per dinar. Stop and think about that for a moment. Maybe jot some thoughts down. I'll give you a moment. Pause the video. I'll give you 5 seconds. So that should have been long enough, hopefully, for you to at least pause the video and maybe write down some answers. Step back for a moment and think about the car market. We're used to just putting dollars on the vertical, right? So if the market clearing price for cars is $25,000, how many cars do you get for $25,000? You get one car. And so the price that we're used to thinking about is dollars per car, or dollars per PlayStation, or dollars per house. Implicitly, what we are dealing with in markets is dollars per unit of the good. So if we are looking at the dinar market, then what we would need is units of currency per dinar. Just like when we look at the car market, what we were looking at is the number of units of currency per car. So that's the second thing that helps stave off confusion. If you are looking at the dinar market, you need to have euros per dinar, or yen per dinar, or whatever per dinar. If you're looking at the dollar market, you're going to want euros per dollar, or dinar per dollar or any of those things. So that's the first thing. If you keep that clear and you know which direction you're dealing with, then actually exchange rates become very straightforward. Now, why is the supply of dinar vertical? Well, an upward sloping supply schedule implies that if you increase the number of dollars you pay per dinar, there will be an increase in the number of dinar available. And if we think about the bureaucratic incentive structures for central banks, while there may be some bureaucratic pressure when the exchange rate goes up to increase the number of units in circulation, it's not a direct result of the price of a dinar. And so it's not saying that this can't move, but we would put it vertical to remind ourselves that there is no direct relationship there and that we would need to tell a different story as to why the supply is changing. So those would be the small changes we would make here. We're dealing with dollars per dinar, or if we're looking at the dollar market, we would be looking at dinar per dollar, and we would deal with a vertical supply schedule. And just like any other market, the intersection of supply and demand, so that we have neither a surplus nor a shortage, will be our market clearing price. And so you may think, by the way, and it may be said, that countries affect their exchange rates. They only do it, generally in this day and age, they only do it successfully through open market operations, by either buying or selling dollars, or buying or selling dinar. It's the same thing that people say is the government is setting interest rates. The government doesn't, in most modern economies that are doing well, the government doesn't set interest rates. The federal government does not have direct control over interest rates. There is no lever in the basement of the Federal Reserve that they can turn to directly affect interest rates. They have to, again, either buy or sell assets in the market for loanable funds. They have to affect either the supply of loanable funds or the demand for loanable funds. And that's exactly the same thing here. Okay. Nope. So maybe I go back here. This was just the corollary. So if we're looking at the dollar market, we would look at the supply of dollars. Again, I would argue that's vertical. We have the demand for dollars. The intersection of those will tell us how many dinar it takes to get a dollar. So hopefully that helps to maybe clear up some of the misunderstandings about exchange rates. My hope is that'll make it easier. Now, one of the other things that I avoid when talking about exchange rates are the terms deflation or devaluation of a currency, or an increase in the valuation of a currency. The question is, are we talking about dinar per dollars or dollars per dinar? So if the dollar becomes less valuable, the dinar-dollar exchange rate will go down. It will take fewer dinar to get a dollar. On the other hand, a decrease in the value of the dollar will cause an increase in the dollar per dinar exchange rate. And so I typically, when I talk about these things, say pick one. Are we talking about dinar per dollar? Or are we talking about dollars per dinar? Okay, we're talking about dinar per dollar. Then what is happening is, and then I can work through the scenario. So hopefully that'll help clear up some other things. All right, so this is, just like any other market, how we end up with exchange rates. Now we are dealing with floating exchange rates rather than pegged exchange rates here. But for our purposes here, everything else, exchange rates are determined by supply and demand, although of course governments can play some role in that. If you remember our balance of payments, the changes in reserves, governments do hold foreign currencies as reserve currencies to try and smooth out fluctuations, or ostensibly to try and smooth out fluctuations in the exchange rate. Now, the one weird thing about exchange rates is nobody cares about this market at all. This is a relative price. Nobody wants the dollars. Nobody wants the dinar. Nobody wants the yen. What people want is what the yen, the dollars, or the dinar can get us. And so it's a weird one because we're talking about a relative price and it's an instrumental market. So I wouldn't use this to analyze consumer, producer, government, etc. What I would do is look at what this does in other markets, or look at what it does in our balance of payments equation, or in somewhere else to figure out what happens to well-being. But if we were analyzing the demand for dinar, we would, as I mentioned, put dollars per dinar on the vertical. And if we're looking at the dollar market, we would put dinar per dollar, or again, it could be yen per dollar, euro per dollar, yuan per dollar, RMB per dollar, etc. But the key is what goes in the denominator is the good that we are examining. Okay. So hopefully that makes sense. Now, the question is what shifts demand? Now, you hopefully remember, if we go back, that what shifts demand in the good market, we have preferences, income. Again, we have to specify normal or an inferior good, the price of substitutes, or rather the cost of substitutes and complements, the number of consumers, expectations, and information about the benefit. Okay. How about the demand for a currency? Well, as I mentioned, nobody actually wants the currency. They want what the currency can get you. And what can you get with a currency? Well, you can buy a country's goods or services. So an increase in demand for exports, either American goods or American services, either one. If there's an increase in the demand, what's going to happen is more people at all prices, in other words, at all exchange rates, are going to want US dollars, because they want to buy U.S. exports. And so that would mean that we would have an increase in our demand schedule. In other words, it would move out, if you want to think about it in those terms. In other words, all of our dots would move to the right. A decrease in the demand for U.S. exports, all of those dots are going to move to the left. Does this tell us exactly what would cause an increase or decrease in the demand for U.S. exports? Not a bit, right? That's the sort of thing that we would need to... This, again, like all of our other tools, is a framework for storytelling. And so in this case, we would have to tell a story. Have American exports increased or decreased in demand or remained unchanged? So that's one reason why people would want a unit of currencies. They want to buy the goods and services that are produced in that country. Why else would people want a unit of currency? Well, it turns out the other thing that they would want is they would want to invest in that country. In effect, we're dealing with the current account versus the capital account. So, if American investments become more attractive, what would happen is that all of our dots in our demand schedule would move out and to the right. In other words, at all prices, more people would want to change their or a unit of currency into American dollars. And so our demand schedule would shift out or increase. At all prices, a greater quantity of dollars would be consumed. On the other hand, a decrease in the desire to invest in the United States, you guessed it, means at all prices, our dots would shift in to the left. Fewer people would want to buy US dollars. And that's it for demand. Now again, does this tell us anything about the story that is behind the answer here? Not at all. This again is a framework for telling stories. And as we should by now, hopefully in our toolkit, have a number of things that might affect people's desire to invest in the United States. So let's see if we can, again, I think we could turn this into dollars, but I personally have found it's easier to see how much we understand these tools if we can actually map them onto something we may not know a lot about. So let's see here. Hybrid cars become popular, or increase in popularity, holding all else constant. What's going to happen to the exchange rate with the dollar? Well, let's stop for a moment. What should we be looking at? If we are looking at the dinar market, in other words, what's happening in Iraq, we would want to look at dollars per dinar. And so what we would want to understand is the attractiveness of Iraqi exports and investments. Now, something some of you may not know is one of Iraq's major exports is oil. And so arguably, hybrid cars use less oil, and so hybrid cars would decrease the attractiveness of Iraqi exports, thus causing the demand for dinar to shift in. Of course, you could also argue that as a result of hybrid cars, people now actually like to drive more because it's cheaper, and so maybe there isn't much of a change. Fine. Again, this, like I said, is a framework for telling better stories. We could, of course, go out and empirically look and see what happens, but this is sort of how we can approach this. How about if there's civil war in Libya, which there was when I put this presentation together? Well, Libya is another major oil exporter. And so, or at least a large portion of their exports are oil, or a large portion is oil. So civil war means that it's going to be harder to get at Libyan oil, which will mean that, relatively speaking, Iraqi oil has become more attractive, which means at all prices, more people would want to consume dinar, they'd want to buy dinar, so that would shift our demand out, and what would happen to the dollar per dinar exchange rate? Stop for a moment and think about that. Maybe draw that up. So we have a vertical supply schedule for dinar. Doesn't mean it can't move left and right, but it means that there's no reason it's directly tied to the exchange rate. The demand schedule increases. That will cause no change in quantity and an increase in the number of dollars it takes to buy a dinar. At the same time, that would cause a decrease in the number of dinar it takes to buy a dollar, which is again why I don't like appreciation or depreciation of a currency. What I find better to talk about is an increase or a decrease in the dollar per dinar exchange rate, or an increase or a decrease in the dinar per dollar exchange rate. How about if we have protests in the Middle East? Well, in that case, I would argue that protests and political unrest tend to decrease not the attractiveness of Iraqi oil, because again, you can pretty much stick that in a tanker and get it across the border. It's still going to be oil. It's going to be there. However, it will decrease the attractiveness for foreigners to invest in Iraq. And what that would do, in my view, I think, at least on this surface level, it would cause, at all prices, fewer people would want dinar. And so that would shift in our dollar per dinar exchange rate, which would reduce the number of dollars it takes to buy a dinar. On the other hand, if those protests from the Arab Spring resulted in, and sadly they largely did not, but had they resulted in effective reform that ensured the independence of the judiciary and an honest government and access to international markets and so on and so on and so forth, basically all of the things on our institutions list that we've spent some time and energy absorbing, that would cause more people at all prices to want to buy dinar, which would shift our demand schedule for dinar out, which would cause an increase in the dollar-dinar exchange rate and a decrease in the dinar-dollar exchange rate. How about an increase in the interest rate? Now, this is oftentimes one where people get stuck. What's going to happen here? Well, holding everything else constant, this is going to make Iraqi investments more attractive. So if the only thing that changed was the interest rate, in other words, we're holding the riskiness of the investments constant, we're holding the institutions constant, so on and so forth. You increase the interest rate, you pay people more to invest in Iraq. That's going to increase the attractiveness of investment in Iraq, which would cause an increase in the demand schedule. In other words, at all prices, people would consume more. In other words, all of our dots shift out and to the right, which would cause an increase in the dollar-dinar exchange rate and a decrease in the dinar-dollar exchange rate. Whew! How about another one? An increase in a desire to hold dinar as a reserve currency. Well, people want to hold dinar as a reserve currency. That would be an increase in demand at all prices. More people would want dinar, or the same number of people would want more dinar, which means all of our dots would shift out and to the right. Our demand schedule would increase, which means the dollar-dinar exchange rate would go up. The dinar-dollar exchange rate would go down. Whew. Okay. So that's how to play with the demand. But what's going to shift the supply? Well, if we go back early in the semester, let's think about what generally shifts supply. Well, we have cost of inputs. Obviously, that includes opportunity costs. We have the number of suppliers. We have technology. And we have expectations and information about cost. But again, that's in the goods market. Nobody wants dollars or dinar themselves, there are people who collect them, but that is such a small portion that we largely ignore that. And so, what shifts the supply of a currency? Think about it. What shifts the supply of a currency? You know the answer, whether or not you know that you know the answer. Well, there's going to be the number of units of a currency in circulation, and there's going to be the number of times in a year those units are used for purchases or for a transaction. So if M goes up, What will happen to the supply of a currency? Our supply schedule will shift out and to the right. That increase in the amount of money in circulation need have nothing to do with the exchange rate, and usually it has very little to do with the exchange rate. On the other hand, we could have in the current, so think about what's happened in the current environment. As a result of COVID, we can argue that velocity has increased significantly. That would mean a decrease in the supply of a unit of currency, of dollars. So if we look at the dollar market, that decrease in the supply of dollars, holding everything else constant, would cause an increase in the dinar per dollar exchange rate and a decrease in the dollar per dinar exchange rate. However, at the same time that the velocity has gone down, the federal government has been at least talking about increasing the amount of money in circulation, possibly. If they did that in line with our new Keynesian theory and directly counteracted the decrease in velocity, they would increase the money supply exactly equal to that decrease, which would mean in aggregate, on balance, there would be no change in our supply of loanable funds. Of course, the COVID crisis may well have affected the demand for loanable funds. Has it changed the attractiveness of American investments? Almost certainly. Has it changed the relative attractiveness of American goods? Almost certainly. And so again, this framework doesn't give us the answers, but it gives us a set of tools to map our stories and the information that we see onto supply, demand, neither or both. And just like before, we can take information to supply, demand, neither or both, to the direction, to the change in price and quantity. In this arena, I would not go to the next step of looking at the impact on consumer, producer, government, and total. Rather, I would go and think about what this meant in the current account market, the capital account market, the market for goods and services, and so on and so forth. Because again, despite our common use of language that we love money, almost none of us do. Again, there are coin collectors and currency collectors. For them, they really just value the currency itself. But for most of us, we value what the currency can get us, not the currency. Now, what we've just covered is what will help us understand short-run fluctuations in the exchange rate. So we can use this to explain supply and demand shifts. But what determines either you can view the long-run exchange rate or where we are in the first place? So stop and think about similarly risky assets. What should the yield on them be? And the answer is it should be the same. Again, given enough time to adjust in the long run. Why? Because if similarly risky assets were priced differently, so if one of them was priced more highly than another, in other words, the price to acquire that asset was higher, people would flock towards the lower priced asset, bidding up its price, and they would be leaving the higher priced asset, causing its price to fall until those prices converge. What should the price of the same good in two different locations be? Well, adjusting for or ignoring transportation costs, as we hopefully realize, if we ignore transportation costs, we would expect the price on the same good in two different locations to converge. Now, of course, you might say, but the goods are never quite exactly the same in two different locations, and that is definitely a valid point, which is part of the reason why identifying price discrimination is so difficult. That's a side note. That's something beyond what we're really talking about here. But for those who remember price discrimination or who know anything about price discrimination, that is one of the issues there. So if say I'm thinking about taking advantage of the current crisis to buy a car. I don't currently own a car. I think that probably this autumn will be a very good time to buy cars because dealerships are going to have a lot of unsold cars and maybe quite a few repossessed cars because people didn't make their payments. And while I don't wish ill on anybody, it would be a shame to let those cars just sit on a lot. Okay. So let's say that I find, I don't know what car I decide to buy. Say I decide to buy a VW Golf. And I say, gee, this car sells the same car. Maybe I decide to buy new, which I almost certainly never would. Well, maybe I would eventually. But as a single individual without kids who are dependent on the transportation, who lives within walking distance of the office and has recourse to Uber, I probably would buy an older car. But let's say I buy, I don't know, a 2015 Subaru. Well, no, I said VW Golf, right? There we go. VW Golf. It's my dream car. So I say that 2015 VW Golf costs $10,000 in Billings with the same mileage and the same trim package, costs $10,000 in Billings and $15,000 in Bozeman. Well, where am I going to buy it? I'm going to buy it in Billings. Somebody who's looking at buying the car in Bozeman, what are they going to do? They're going to come to Billings. Now, of course, entrepreneurs are probably going to identify this fact, and it would make sense for entrepreneurs to come to Billings, to buy a bunch of VW Golfs and take them to Bozeman, thus increasing the supply, and the supply in Bozeman increasing the demand in Billings, bidding up the price in Billings, bidding down the price in Bozeman. Okay. The exact same logic applies here because of currency arbitrage. There are people who engage in arbitrage, taking advantage of differences in price around the world. And so we would actually expect the purchasing power of currencies to converge. It's the exact same logic. And we're talking here about the rate of goods and services exchange, not the nominal exchange rate. So here's the question, is this true? So let's look at my favorite thing, falafel. So a falafel sandwich in Sulaymaniyah cost 250 dinar when I was there, which was the equivalent at prevailing exchange rates of 23 US cents. A falafel sandwich in New York costs about $5, probably more now, but at the time roughly $5, which was the equivalent of 5,842 dinar at prevailing exchange rates. What this means is, wait, a falafel sandwich in Suli and a falafel sandwich in New York, they don't converge, right? So what this would imply is that what I should have done while I was in Iraq would have been to package up a lot of falafel sandwiches and ship them to New York, and that there would be a large gain from that process. That's what this would imply. And so what this brings us to is what's called the purchasing power parity theorem. You may remember back when I was showing you GDP across time, I said we're looking at constant international dollars. Again, we've already covered that. Converting from nominal to real across 10,000 years is difficult, but it is possible and it has been done. We also, however, would want not to rely purely on exchange rates, but rather on the purchasing power parity. So purchasing power parity theorem is that the real purchasing power of a money should be about the same whether it's spent at home or converted into another currency and spent abroad. Okay, so what does that really mean? Well, see if I can maybe illustrate this. What this means is the same good should be the same price in two different locations. Or alternately, a more broad version of this is that a general bundle of goods should be about the same everywhere. In other words, if you think about this, if a dollar can buy me a falafel sandwich in Iraq, and it can only buy me a fifth of a falafel sandwich in New York. Now this is absent all other considerations. It would make sense for me to turn my dollar into dinar and go buy my falafel sandwiches in Iraq. Now obviously falafel sandwiches may be an exception for that. There might be some things that would get in the way. But if this deviated significantly, we would expect that to happen. So hopefully that logic makes sense as to why, if my dollars can get me more if I turn them into Chinese yuan or renminbi, that it would make sense for me to turn my dollars into renminbi and go purchase all of my goods and services in China and bring them back to the United States. I hope that makes sense. And so what that tells us is that exchange rates, the long-run exchange rate, should adjust so that purchasing power parity adjusts. But we have some worries about that given the falafel market. So this isn't always going to work. And so let's see about some exceptions. One exception is going to be high transport costs. So if it's really costly to transport something, it might be that there is a price differential. So say that it costs $10,000 for a VW Golf in Billings and $15,000 in Bozeman. If it costs $6,000 to transport the VW Golf from Billings to Bozeman, we would not expect the prices to converge. Of course, the cost of transporting a VW is nowhere near $6,000. It's really a couple gallons of gas and 2 hours and some inconvenience of somebody's time. Now, I'm pretty sure we could find somebody whose opportunity cost of time is well below $6,000. But in cases of high transport costs, we would not expect prices to converge. We would also not expect currency rates to converge. However, once we account for the transportation costs, we should expect the price to be the same. Now, does high transport cost, does that account for falafel? Well, you might say, look, it's not really possible to transport fresh falafel sandwiches. You do that, by the time they get there, they're rotten, they're not any good, and I'll largely grant you that point. However, it's pretty possible to transport the ingredients in falafel, so that doesn't really explain the difference. Maybe it's impossible to transport falafel sandwiches. Again, I would argue that it is possible. Again, maybe not the final product, but the raw ingredients that go into it. It's definitely possible to transport those. Now again, the container and modern logistics have driven down the cost of transportation sufficiently that while it does exist, it is a relatively minor portion of the production cost. Certainly on the historical level. Is it impossible to transport falafel sandwiches? Maybe, but it's definitely not impossible to transport the raw ingredients. Generally speaking, I would argue that the main thing that falls into the impossible to transport category is experiences. Now, some forms of land, right, you can't really transport the Grand Canyon, although you maybe could. People have done it with houses and castles and other things like that. But, the Grand Canyon, the reason what you can't transport there, you can transport the land, you could cut out a chunk of the Grand Canyon, you could ship it off, you could rebuild it somewhere else. What we're really talking about, though, is the Grand Canyon in that situation has a very different feel and experience to it. So an example of this, something that is near and dear to my heart, definitely an experience, was one of the times when I was in Iraq. I took a vacation to Jordan, and I went to Petra. And Petra, if any of you have seen Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, I know that's a dwindling portion of you, but you can Google Petra, P-E-T-R-A. And it is a place where they carved a bunch of tombs into the side of sandstone hills. It's phenomenal. Now, I went to Petra, and you wander down this narrow, ever-narrowing draw, and it's really neat. And then you pop out, and you have this treasury in front of you, and if you do it at the right time, the sun is hitting it perfectly, and they have things there where you can go in the evening, and you can see it in candlelight, and it's really a unique experience. If you're ever in that part of the world, it is, in my view, worth seeing. I also went to the Dead Sea and couldn't sink. It was a different experience. It's going to be very hard to transport those sort of things. My guess is some of you have been to Yellowstone Park. It's hard to transport that experience. So again, I would put the main thing under impossible to transport as certain very unique experiences. Turns out, another exception is trade barriers. So when we think about falafel, I actually don't think it's very costly to transport the chickpeas and the tomatoes and the onions and many of these other things. The key here, the big one, is in the falafel market, that it is, by and large, illegal for a falafel vendor in Iraq who wants to make falafel sandwiches in New York to move to New York. Do you think any of the falafel vendors in Iraq would be willing to move to New York and make more money? Absolutely. However, they are legally barred from doing so. And this is definitely true. We actually have relatively low barriers to the movement of goods and services. So over the last 100 years, the barriers to goods and services, well, maybe not the last 100 years, but the last 60 years, the barriers to movement in goods and services have, up until the last sort of Trump administration and recent events, the barriers have really largely fallen over the last 60 years. However, compared to the turn of the century, we actually have higher barriers to the movement of labor. And if you think about the fact that labor is oftentimes a major component in many production functions, oftentimes the estimate of labor as a share of the factors of production, as we talked about, is roughly 2/3. Capital ends up being around 1/3. In other words, the alpha is 1/3 and labor is around 2/3. And so that's a major part. And so we wouldn't necessarily expect the purchasing power parity of currencies to converge when there are large trade barriers. Okay. So if we think about the other thing here, if we look at the interaction, we expand this out to talk about monetary policy. We can increase the amount of money in circulation in Iraq. Now, typically, as we've already talked about, in a neo-Keynesian world, wages and prices are relatively sticky. And so if you think about an exchange rate adjusting very quickly, we increase the money supply, that will cause a decrease in the dollar per dinar exchange rate, which means, in effect, until prices in Iraq reset to reflect this fact, Iraqi goods have gone on sale for the rest of the world. So say it cost 500 dinar for something, and previously it was 1,000 dinar per dollar, although I should look the other way because we're looking at dollars per dinar, and so that would be 1/500th, so $1 per 500 dinar, so 1/500. The money supply in Iraq increases, and say the dollar per dinar exchange rate goes from 1/500 to 1/1,000, and now a 2,000 dinar item in Iraq, instead of costing $4, now costs $2. So in effect, Iraqi goods have gone on sale. So what happens next? That would make Iraqi exports more attractive, which would increase the demand for Iraqi exports, and it would increase the demand for Iraqi dinar, which we would expect eventually, once we adjust for the fact that you can't trade internationally, or that you can't move goods and services internationally, or labor internationally, we would expect the exchange rate to revert to a point where it equalizes the purchasing power parity. Okay. All right. And so we have some other pieces here. The book goes into this, but basically we have sort of the short-run fluctuations driven by things that affect the demand and the supply. And then we also have the long-run implications for exchange rates, where we would expect, absent barriers to the movement of goods and services, or it being impossible, or it being extremely costly to move them, we would expect exchange rates to equilibrate, or to end up equalizing the purchasing power of a currency, whether it is spent domestically or converted into a foreign currency and spread abroad, or spent abroad. And so what we've analyzed here is what we would call floating exchange rates. And that's what many, if not most, countries have. Some countries still have a fixed exchange rate, a legal exchange rate that they have mandated, and if you exchange for something other than that, you are probably outside of the law. Other countries have they have an official exchange rate. The Iraqi government published an official exchange rate, but that was oftentimes completely unrelated to the actual exchange rate. So fixed or pegged exchange rates, we could have government either legally mandates that you must exchange goods, or you must exchange foreign currency for domestic currency at a fixed rate. Countries usually make that legal requirement so that they can, in effect, expropriate exporters. So in North Korea, if you export goods, although there isn't much exporting, government officials who return to the country after having worked or lived abroad have to convert their foreign currency at a fixed exchange rate. Usually that is a way for the North Korean government to make money, basically. The more general way that this is done is maybe we have an official fixed exchange rate, which means that you are legally permitted to show up and say, here's $1, I would like the official number of dinar. Now this has some benefits. It means that it keeps governments, it creates a cost of increasing the money supply. Because if you increase the money supply, what happens is the dollar, say we're looking at the dollar per dinar exchange rate falls. And so what will happen is people will rush to convert their, right? They'll convert their dinar. What would they do? So if the dollar per dinar exchange rate falls because we've increased the money supply and we have a specified exchange rate, they would rush to convert their dinar into dollars at the preferable exchange rate, which would, of course, cause a massive outflow of foreign reserves from the central bank and eventually cause them some pain. Either they would have to acquire at great cost those foreign reserves, or they would have to devalue the exchange rate. And so it at least imposes a cost for monetizing the debt. And again, it may lower transaction costs because it makes the exchange rate more predictable, which is going to make it easier for us to negotiate an exchange. Of course, this means there's some cost to this, and this is the reason why many countries have abandoned fixed exchange rates, though some countries in extremis have chosen to actually dollarize. Argentina for a while and Zimbabwe for a while actually just said, we're using dollars, or at least had a fixed exchange rate with the dollar. So one of the problems, obviously, is you have to buy and save enough foreign currencies so that when people come and they want to exchange their currency units into whatever at the specified exchange rate is, that you have enough to do that. And it turns out that people can speculate and they can gamble that you aren't going to have enough reserves, and that can actually be really painful and expensive and can result in capital flight. The other thing, as I mentioned already, is that it is hard to avoid or resist using this for personal or political gain, as North Korea has. Okay, so that's pretty much the end of the conceptual stuff here. Let's see if we can maybe use this for a couple of pieces of analysis. So, ignoring transportation costs, if the price of an iPhone in Sulaymaniyah in Iraq is 950,000 dinar and in Berlin it costs 600 euros, what would you expect the dinar, euro, and euro per dinar exchange rates? So let's assume all of these iPhones are imported, and let's assume that these are the only things we're looking at. In that case, what would we expect? So an iPhone in Suli costs 950,000 dinar, and in Berlin it costs 600. So on purchasing power parity alone, we would expect 600 dinar per 600 euros per 950,000 dinars. So 600 divided by 950, 1, 2, 3. That would mean that our euro per dinar exchange rate, wait for it, would be 0.00063. On the other hand, our dinar per euro exchange rate based purely in the iPhone market. Now, obviously, in the real world, there's more than just that. But we would expect, based purely on this market and purchasing power parity theorem, assuming no difficulties in transporting this, that the dinar per euro exchange rate would be 1,583.33. Next question, how does this change if the Iraqi government puts a 1,000 dinar import tariff on iPhones and the Eurozone puts a 100 euro per iPhone tariff? Well, as we've already talked about, if the world price is 950,000 dinar roughly, who's going to pay the tariff? It's going to all come out of Iraqis, and so the price in Iraq is going to go up to 1,050,000 dinar, while the price of an iPhone in the Eurozone will go up to 700 euro. And so the euro per dinar exchange rate, let's see, would be 0.0067, and the dinar per euro exchange rate would be, see if I get this right, divided by 700, would be 1,500. Hopefully I got those numbers right. You can raise it in the chat in the class if you disagree with my numbers. Okay, so that's exchange rates. That's pretty much all she wrote for the major big picture questions for this semester. I hope this was productive and helpful. Talk to you all soon.